The sharp metallic click of our deadbolt always landed in my chest like a coin dropped in a jar. Tuesday morning, it clicked again when my wife left for work, and my 7-year-old Ethan stopped coloring mid-stroke like the sound had yanked a string inside him. I told myself it was nothing. A door was just a door. But when I heard my own voice a minute later, low and flat, I watched his shoulders climb toward his ears, the same way mine used to. I had built my whole adult life around being the opposite of my dad. No yelling, no fists, no slamming, warm breakfasts, shoes lined up by the mat, a calendar on the fridge so nobody got surprised. I called it stability. If I was honest, it was control dressed up as love, and I kept it polished because I was hiding something from my wife, the complaint at work, the one I swore was a misunderstanding. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a second-grade math worksheet, his pencil gripped like it might snap. The overhead light hummed. The coffee maker burped. I hovered behind him, reading his answers over his shoulder, even though I knew better than to do that. He got stuck on a word problem, erased a hole in the paper, and I felt that pressure rise in my throat, like a valve tightening. He said he didn't get it. He said it soft, like he was apologizing for taking up air. I leaned in, pointed, and my voice came out controlled, almost gentle if you didn't know what to listen for. It was the tone my father used when he wanted the house to hold still. I told Ethan he was being careless. I told him he needed to focus. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I didn't even raise my eyebrows. Ethan flinched anyway. Not big, not dramatic. Just a quick inward fold of his body, like he was bracing for weather. His pencil skittered, and he tucked his chin, eyes fixed on the worksheet like it could protect him. My stomach dropped hard enough I tasted metal. I tried to scrub it off fast. I made pancakes too sweet and asked him about recess in a voice that felt pasted on. I lined up his sneakers by size, toes perfectly touching the edge of the mat. I wiped the counter, even though it was already clean. Ethan answered in single words without looking up. At 4:12 that afternoon, while I stood at the dock at my logistics job, listening to forklifts beep and pallets thud, my phone buzzed with a calendar invite from HR, Friday, 3 p.m. I snapped over a worksheet on Tuesday, and Ethan flinched like he knew me better than I knew myself. By that afternoon, HR had scheduled me for Friday at 3 p.m., and I kept telling myself those two things weren't connected. The warehouse smelled like shrink wrap and diesel, the kind of smell that sat in your hoodie even after you washed it. I walked past the time clock, and my badge caught on the turnstile the way it always did now. There was old sticker residue on the back of the badge clip from some safety campaign we'd done last summer, and it made the plastic tacky. The clip peeled, the badge swung, and the scanner flashed red like it was rejecting me on purpose. The delay was small, 10 seconds maybe, but 10 seconds was enough for my supervisor to look up from his tablet and watch me fumble. 10 seconds was enough for my pulse to start sprinting. We were behind on outbound shipments because a vendor had shorted a pallet, and the afternoon crew was already grumbling. I went straight to the staging area, straightened crooked labels, shoved a cart a little too hard. I kept my voice even when I gave instructions, but my face felt locked. People moved faster around me without me asking. That was my version of yelling. I made the air heavy. Around lunch, my wife texted that Ethan's teacher had called. Ethan had shut down during a reading check-in and wouldn't answer, just stared at his paper until the teacher stopped trying. My wife asked if something happened that morning. I stared at the message, thumb hovering. The simplest thing would have been to tell the truth. I got sharp, Ethan got scared, I hated myself for it. Instead, I typed that he'd been frustrated with homework and we'd handled it. I added a smiley face like that was a bandage. That afternoon, a driver showed up early for a load that wasn't ready. My supervisor asked, in that careful HR-adjacent tone, if I was doing okay. I nodded too fast. I felt my jaw clench. I felt the old engine inside me rev, the one that ran on silence and control. When I got home, the shoes were still lined up by the mat because I'd done it that morning like a ritual. Ethan was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket even though the heat was on. He looked up when I walked in and then looked away like he'd touched something hot. I tried to fix it with action. I offered to play catch. I suggested pizza. I folded laundry with exaggerated calm. Ethan stayed small, eyes flicking to my hands, my mouth, the doorway. After dinner, my wife didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just watched me the way you watch a pot you're afraid is going to boil over. Then she walked to the closet, pulled out an overnight bag, and set it by the front door under the deadbolt. Friday at 3 p.m. suddenly didn't feel like the only deadline in the house. By Wednesday night, my wife had a bag by the door, and I had HR waiting for me at Friday 3 p.m. I kept trying to talk my way out of both without actually saying anything. Ethan was in bed, and the house made those small nighttime sounds it only made when nobody was brave enough to move. The fridge clicking on, the faint creak of the hallway floorboards settling. I stood in the kitchen, wiping the same spot on the counter until my hand cramped. My wife sat at the table with her phone face down like it was something dangerous. I told myself she was bluffing with the bag. I told myself HR was routine. I told myself Ethan flinched because kids are jumpy. Then my wife flipped her phone over and I saw the little waveform on the screen, the kind that only showed up when there was audio. "I recorded you." My throat went dry, and I tried to laugh like it was a joke I didn't get. "Why would you do that?" "Because you keep acting like it didn't happen." "I didn't yell. That's not the point. I was stressed. I fixed it. You made pancakes and called it fixed. I'm not my father. I know. That's why this hurts." She slid the phone across the table. Her fingers trembled just a little, like she hated the part of herself that had decided to become a witness instead of a spouse. "Listen to it." I didn't touch the phone right away. I stared at the deadbolt above the handle, at the tiny scratch marks in the metal from years of keys hitting it. My dad's house had a deadbolt like that. His click was a weather report, safe or unsafe, smile or disappear. I don't want to hear myself. Then you don't get to pretend. I'm trying. Trying isn't the same as being safe. I would never hurt him. You already are. I hit play. My own voice filled the kitchen, and it was worse than I remembered because it wasn't loud. It was controlled. It was clean. It had that quiet edge that said love was conditional. It sounded like a man who could take warmth away as punishment and call it discipline. Ethan's tiny intake of breath was in there too, a little hitch like a seatbelt locking. I felt heat crawl up my neck. My hands went numb. That's not how it felt in my head. That's why I recorded it. I couldn't look at her. I looked at the mat by the door instead, at Ethan's sneakers lined up like soldiers. I heard my dad again, not his words, just the absence around them. My wife didn't soften, she didn't attack, she just held steady. "Friday at 3, you can go in there and talk about your job," she said, voice low. "Tonight, you're going to talk about your son." I nodded once, like a man accepting a sentence. Thursday morning at 10:17, as I stood by the loading bay watching a pallet jack wobble under too much weight, my phone buzzed again. HR had emailed an attachment for my Friday 3 p.m. meeting, doccam_audio_Thursday.m4a. My wife had played me my own voice, and now HR had audio too, all of it marching toward Friday at 3 p.m. Somewhere between those two recordings, I started to understand I couldn't outclean this with chores and good intentions. Thursday after work, I drove to a counseling office in a strip mall between a vape shop and a tax place with a faded banner still hanging from last April. The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner and old magazines. My knee bounced so hard the chair squeaked. I kept thinking about that attachment name, the way the letters looked so official, like my worst moments had finally become a file. The counselor didn't say anything magical. He asked about my father, and I surprised myself by talking about keys in a bowl, the deadbolt click, the way silence could feel like a hand around your throat. He asked what I did when I felt the pressure rising. I told him I held still and got colder, like that was better than exploding. He gave me 2 tools that sounded almost stupid because they were so simple. A physical 5-minute timer, not an app, a real timer you could slap, a commitment to step away before the words came out sharp, and a safe word, something my son could say to stop the interaction before he had to flinch. The word that kept coming to my mind was the one I hated most: door. I went home and put a cheap red kitchen timer on the counter where Ethan could see it. I sat on the floor with him after dinner, not looming, not standing over him like a judge. My voice shook a little when I explained that sometimes Dad's throat got tight and Dad needed to take 5 minutes so Dad didn't get scary. I told him he could say door anytime he felt that scary feeling, and I would stop. Ethan stared at the timer like it might bite. Then he nodded, small and serious, like he was signing something. Friday came too fast. By 2:38 p.m., I was sitting outside the HR office with my badge in my hand because I kept rubbing the sticky residue on the clip until my thumb felt raw. I could hear my heartbeat under the fluorescent hum. I imagined my son's flinch like a replay I couldn't turn off. I imagined that doc cam audio, my voice in a warehouse, turning grown men into quiet shadows. HR called me in. They slid a printed statement across the table. They played a 30-second clip. In it, my voice said a coworker's name, the way my father used to say mine when he wanted the room to shrink. They waited for excuses. I thought about Ethan's sneakers lined up by the mat. I thought about my wife's phone. I thought about the 5-minute timer sitting on my counter like a promise. I told them the truth. I asked for leave. I accepted a demotion when they offered it like a lifeline with barbs. At 2:59 p.m., with Friday 3 p.m. staring at me from the wall clock, I slid my badge across the table, and the plastic clacked against the wood like a deadbolt locking from the inside. Friday 3 p.m. passed with my badge on someone else's desk, and my job suddenly smaller than it had been the day before. I came home carrying a cardboard box of desk junk, and a weight I couldn't hand off to anyone. The money part hit first, like it always did. I sat at the kitchen table that night with a legal pad, writing numbers that didn't want to add up. My wife didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She just sat across from me, quiet in a way that didn't feel like punishment. The house was still. Ethan slept down the hall, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel like the silence was sharpening itself. That was when the guilt finally stopped hiding behind excuses and showed itself plain. Last winter, Ethan had spilled a glass of milk right by the front door. It wasn't a big spill, but it was right on the rug, and the old engine in me had kicked on. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't slammed anything. I'd gone cold. I'd told him to sit at the table and think about what he'd done while I cleaned it. Then I'd clean slow on purpose, making him wait, letting the air stretch. At some point, he'd started crying, quiet, trying to be brave. I'd walk to the door, check the lock like my father used to, and the deadbolt had made that sharp metallic click. Ethan's eyes had snapped to it. I remember thinking, see, this is calm, this is control, this is safe. Then I'd left him alone at the table and closed the hallway door between us so I didn't have to hear him. I told myself I was giving us both space. What I was really doing was teaching him the same lesson my father taught me. Love could disappear behind a door. I didn't tell my wife that part. Not then. I carried it like a stone, and Tuesday's flinch had been the stone finally rolling into the open. The next week, with my demotion and paperwork filed and counseling on the calendar, the real test came in the smallest way. Another worksheet, another evening. The same kitchen light humming. Ethan got stuck, pencil hovering. I felt the pressure rise in my throat, that tightening, that heat behind my eyes. My hands wanted to go still. My face wanted to lock. I could feel the old engine hunting for its groove. The red timer sat on the counter, bright as a stop sign. I forced my palm onto it and twisted. The ticking started immediately, loud in the quiet kitchen. I stood up and stepped back like the counselor told me, like my wife needed me to. I walked to the sink and ran water I didn't need, just to have something to do with my hands. Behind me, a chair creaked. Ethan's breath caught. The old part of me wanted to turn and finish the problem, finish the moment, finish him. Instead, I stayed facing the sink. I felt my jaw unclench a millimeter at a time. I stared at the stream of water and listened to the timer chew through seconds like it was doing the work for me. Then, from the table, Ethan said it, small but clear. Door. The word hit me like a hand on my chest, not shoving, just stopping. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't defiance. It was my son trusting that I meant what I said. I turned around slow. I kept my voice low, but I softened it on purpose, like you soften your grip when you realize you're holding too tight. I nodded once and stepped away again. 5 minutes wasn't a cure, it was breaks. It was me paying attention to the moment before damage. When the timer dinged, I went back to the table and sat beside him, not behind him. We did the problem together, and when he got it right, his shoulders dropped like he'd been carrying something invisible all day. Later, when I tucked him in, He reached for my wrist with sleepy fingers and held on like he needed proof I wasn't going anywhere. I stood at his bedroom door for a second longer than usual, listening to his breathing settle into something even. I pulled the door mostly closed, and when the latch caught, the click was soft this time. The kind that didn't signal danger, just a house holding steady.